This presentation is for Chapter 4, Cost Management Systems, Activity-Based, Just-in-Time, and Quality Management Systems. In this learning objective, we are going to learn how to use activity-based costing to compute predetermined overhead allocation rates and allocate indirect cost. So in activity-based management, the managers will use activity-based cost information to make decisions that will improve customer satisfaction while also increasing profits. Activity-based costing focuses on the cost of activities as the building blocks for allocating indirect costs to products and services. So when we use activity-based costing, we first have to identify the activities that are involved in the manufacturing and selling of the products to the customers, and then we also have to determine what is the primary cost driver for each of those activities, and that will be our allocation base. So as we see on this slide, an allocation base is usually going to be something that is unique to that activity. So in quality inspections, our allocation base might be number of inspections. In warranty services, it might be the number of service calls. So we just want to be able to identify as our allocation base what is the primary cost driver for the overhead costs for that activity. So companies like Smart Touch Learning that have diverse products can often obtain better costing information by using activity-based costing and activity-based management. This slide shows the 4 steps that are used to develop an activity-based costing system for allocating manufacturing overhead costs to products. First, the company needs to identify the activities and estimate their total indirect costs. Next, they have to identify the allocation base for each of those activities and estimate the total quantity of each allocation base. Then compute a predetermined overhead allocation rate for each activity, and then allocate the indirect cost to the cost object. So in identifying activities and estimating their indirect costs, the companies need to analyze all of the activities that are required for a product or service, and this will force the managers to think about how each activity might be improved or whether it's even necessary at all. Using Smart Touch Learning, we are going to go through the 4 steps in activity-based costing. The first step will be for Smart Touch Learning to identify the activities and estimate their total indirect cost. So on this slide, we can see that Smart Touch Learning's management has identified setup, production, and testing as the primary activities involved in the processing of the tablet computers. Within setup, they have identified the allocation base to be the number of batches. For production, they have identified direct labor hours, and in testing, the number of tests. So first, they will need to estimate the total manufacturing overhead for each activity. Then they're going to have to estimate their total allocation base to get that predetermined overhead rate, and then that will be used to allocate the manufacturing overhead to the standard and the premium models. In step 2, this is going to be where they identify that allocation base and then estimate the total quantity of each allocation base. So as we saw on the previous slide, they identified number of batches for setup. They estimate the number of batches for the standard and the premium model. They add those together and determine that the allocation base for setup will be 45 batches. For production, they estimate the total direct labor hours for the standard and the premium model, and then they add those together and they got a total of 12,500 direct labor hours, and that will be the allocation base for the overhead for production. Then they estimate the number of tests that they will perform for the standard and the premium model, and they determine that will be 10,000 tests, and that will be divided into the total cost of manufacturing overhead for testing to determine that predetermined overhead allocation rate. This slide shows the actual calculation for each of the predetermined overhead allocation rates for setup, production, and testing. They estimate the total overhead cost for each of those activities, divided it by the total estimate of the overhead allocation base, and they got $400 per batch as the predetermined overhead allocation rate for setup, $1.76 as the overhead allocation rate for production, and that's per direct labor hour, and then they got $6 per test as the overhead allocation rate for testing. The next step will be to allocate those manufacturing overhead costs to each of the tablet computers, so to the standard tablets and the premium tablets. So we're going to have 3 activities: setup, production, and testing. We're going to have the actual quantity of the allocation base, multiply it by the predetermined overhead allocation rate, and that's going to give us the total allocated manufacturing overhead costs for each activity for each tablet. So for standard, we see that we allocated $8,000 for setup, $17,600 for production, and $36,000 in manufacturing costs for testing. When we add those together, we got $61,600 in total manufacturing overhead. Again, we divide that by the total number of units to be produced, and we got manufacturing overhead costs per unit for the standard tablet of $30.80. We do the same thing for the premium model, and we got $10,000 in overhead for setup, $4,400 for production, and $24,000 for testing. Added those together to get total manufacturing overhead for the premium tablet of $38,400. Dividing it by 500 units gives us $76.80 in manufacturing overhead per unit for the premium tablets. This slide shows us the total cost per unit for standard and premium models. So we took the manufacturing overhead cost per unit that we calculated in the previous slide, add those to direct materials cost and direct labor cost per unit, and that gives us our total cost per unit. So this slide compares the total cost per unit using the single plant-wide allocation rate, the multiple department allocation rates, and the activity-based allocation rates. So in the single plant-wide rate, we were only using direct labor costs. When we did the multiple department rate, we used 2 different departments, assembly and software. In the activity-based allocation rate, we used 3 different activities, which was setup, production, and testing. We can see that we have been refining the cost per unit as we use multiple or more activities or allocation basis. So for the standard model, the cost per unit has actually gone down using activity-based allocation rates, and for the premium model, it went up. So this information is important to managers because, again, they're going to use this costing information to determine the price of the units. And it does make a difference when you're competing on sometimes even the pennies on the dollar for each of the prices of the models. But it's important to note that as we've been going through the 3 different types of allocation of overhead, it was just allocating the same amount, $100,000 of estimated overhead, just using different methods. And that is the completion of the presentation for Learning Objective 2.